Welcome to Hebrew Mindset. My name is Tanisha, and today we are speaking with Brother Mitch, and we're actually talking about interpreting the scriptures. So how are you doing today, Mitch?
I'm doing fine, and you?
I'm doing great.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I love to be able to speak to you and ask you a few questions. So one of the questions that we have today is, why has the scripture been interpreted in so many different ways? And you know, there's various different versions of the scripture interpreted. You got the King James Version, the Scriptures Version, you have Amplified Bible, and of course everybody's favorite NIV.
Right.
But so there's various different versions. So tell me why you feel that there's so many different ways that it's been interpreted.
Well, generally speaking, as far as Bible versions are concerned, originally the most prominent one in the U.S. was the King James Version. But it was in Elizabethan English, so that's a little hard to understand. So over the course of time, people started, as the language matured, people started writing or translating Bibles to fit the modern tongue. And it wasn't until in fairly recent history that people started coming out with Bible versions that were quite different than other Bible versions because of the text in which they translated from. There's two main bodies of textual line. There's some are called Textus Receptus, and another one is the Alexandrian text line. So they began translating based on two different bodies of texts. So that changed what was in the scripture. As far as some versions have certain verses and some versions don't have certain verses. The one thing that is consistent throughout is the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And that's been very consistent over time. It's only in the New Testament writings or the Messianic writings that there seems to be a lot of disagreement and missing text or added text or whatever. As far as the interpretation of the scripture, if you go back to the original writings, especially in Hebrew and in the Greek of the New Testament, you can find the answer no matter what English text you have. You just have to remember that there's no inspired English text. Some people believe that, say, for instance, the King James is an expired translation. There is no such thing. Okay, what it is just some people interpreted this, translated it this way, and other people translated it that way. But if you go back to the original Greek and Hebrew text, it's pretty easy to find out what the English should say. And in all the English Bibles, there's error. There's error in the translation. For instance, one of the most popular versions of all time is the King James Version, but it has mistranslated the name of our Creator at least 6,800 times. So that's just one of the errors in translation. So, there's a lot of translational issues that need to be brought up, but generally everything you need to know to understand the faith is in there if you just know where to look. The problem is, how do you interpret the scripture to get the intent out of it? The author of the scripture, according to the Bible, is the Spirit of Yahweh. It says that in 2 Timothy, we are told that the word was inspired. Okay, in fact, I got a quote here from 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. It says, "All scripture is breathed out by Elohim and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for setting straight, for the instruction in righteousness, that the man of Elohim might be fitted, equipped for every good work." So the word translated as inspired it means to divinely breathe out. It's like in the Hebrew understanding, breath and spirit are connected. They're similar. The word, in fact, the two words in Hebrew that translated into spirit are ruach and nashama, and both of these words are connected to the passing of air. One is nashama is the puff of air, where ruach is wind. So they're associated to breath. So what this is saying is that Yahweh, the Father, spoke the scripture out, and the Spirit, his breath, carried it into the hearts of men. Another passage of the scripture saying in 2 Peter 1, it says in verse 20, knowing this first, that no prophecy of scripture came to be of one's own interpretation. Verse 21 says, for the prophecy never came by the desire of man, but the men of Elohim spoke, being moved by the set apart Spirit. So the Spirit would come upon these men, and these men would speak or write through that inspiration. This is why the scripture is consistent, even though it's got many, many different writers. The teaching is very consistent throughout. The reason it's misinterpreted is basically human point of view. You know, some guys have this point of view and some guys have that point of view. You know what I mean? Some people read the scripture from a Greco-Roman mindset. Some people read it from a Chinese mindset. Some read it from some other kind of mindset, some point of view, you know what I mean? Based on their culture and their understanding of the time they live in.
Right.
And that has changed over time based on the cultural influences of in the time people interpret them. The Bible was written in a distinctly Hebrew point of view. It's very Hebrew. All the writers were Hebrew. And that's not to say Jewish. The Jewish mindset and the Hebrew mindset are distinctly different. The Jewish mindset is based on the teachings of rabbis.
Okay.
The Hebrew mindset is based solely on what the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, says. Okay, and so you have to look at the scripture and interpret the scripture based from that idea, what the Old Testament or Tanakh says. That's the foundation. The primary reason people don't really understand the scripture is because the scripture tells us that the natural man, okay, is unable to distinguish spiritual things because he's fleshly. Okay, so only a spiritual man can understand what is being said. So the question is, I suppose, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean to be a spiritual man? So, you know, it comes down to what I consider the two-part principle.
Well, that actually goes into our next question as to if only a spiritual man can truly understand the scripture, then why do many Christian leaders disagree about what it says? And, you know, they're spiritual men, so aren't they, like, don't they understand it better because they're spiritual?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you define a spiritual man. There's a lot of people out there calling themselves spiritual men, but even Christianity wouldn't agree with them. The definition of a spiritual man must be based on what the scripture defines as a spiritual man, not what we in our religious thoughts or practices describe as a spiritual man. There's two elements, like I was saying, the two-part principle, which is very significant to understanding scripture, but we'll go into that another time. But as it refers to being a spiritual man, there's two sides of that. That's who you are in your faith, which is the spiritual part, which is you have to be a believer in Yeshua, the Messiah. You have to be a believer to even get into the spiritual. Okay, being a believer in Messiah is what it means to be in the Spirit. You're in the Spirit if you're a believer in Messiah. Okay, but being those people that are in the Spirit must also walk in the Spirit. It says in Galatians 5:25, it says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Okay, so now you have two different things, being in the Spirit and walking in the Spirit. Okay. As I've said, being in the Spirit has to do with believing in Yeshua. There's a couple passages I'll read here. You have to excuse me, but my memory is not that great, so I have to read things, write them down. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of Elohim dwells in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Elohim, Spirit of Messiah, this one is not of his. So we know that it's through belief in Yeshua Messiah that we receive the Spirit of Yahweh into us. Okay, so it's our belief that puts us in the Spirit. The Spirit comes into us and we are now in the Spirit. I mean, it has to do with belief. Okay. However, walking in the Spirit is a different thing. Okay. Walking in the Spirit is what you do after you come into the Spirit. Okay. You have to remember that when we believed in Yeshua for salvation, Yeshua delivered us from dead works, okay? The things that we did before, sin specifically, that caused death, okay? We were condemned to death because of disobedience, okay? So, we were dead as whole men, both physical and spiritual men. So, when we believed in him, we were born again in the spirit man. The New Testament says that we are born again in the spirit, okay? The fleshly man hasn't been born again. He won't be born again until the resurrection. So we have these two things going on. The spirit man that is born again and the physical man that is not. Mm-hmm. And if you read Romans 7 and 8, Galatians 5, Paul talks about this battle that's going on between the inner fleshly man, the spirit man, and the outer physical man. There's this, he quotes in Romans 7, he says, there's this law inside me, that when I want to do good, evil is present within me. You know what I mean? So he's talking about this dynamic. Well, the spiritual man is the man that has submitted to the faith and brought his fleshly man into subjection. In fact, if you go to Romans 12:1, which I believe I put on this little page here, Romans 12:1 and 2 says, I shall call upon you, therefore, brothers, I call upon you, brothers, through the compassion of Elohim, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and well-pleasing to Elohim, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you prove what is the good and well-pleasing and perfect desire of Elohim. So, this body has to be brought into subjection. And that is what it means to walk in the Spirit. You have this new spirit man inside you, and your spirit man must take control of your physical man, so that he walks in the Spirit. And the question then, what does it mean to walk in the Spirit? You know, there's a lot of ideas of what that means in the Christian church today. But you have to remember that being in the Spirit and being walking in the Spirit are connected. Because Yeshua is the Word made flesh. Okay? So what that means is he is the Word that was written before, what we call the Old Testament, specifically the Torah or the law. He is that, the law made flesh. He became a human being. So the law written in the Old Testament and Messiah can't be separated. And in modern teaching, it's separated the two. Right. You have a Yeshua that people believe that you can believe in Yeshua or Jesus and not have to obey the law. And this is an error. And because of this error, they don't understand what the Scripture says, because they can't walk spiritually. Because Paul himself said in Romans 7:12, verse 12, he said that the law is holy and just and good. Okay, he says in verse 14 that the law is spiritual. So the law, or the Torah, given at Mount Sinai through Moses to the people of Israel, is the how you walk spiritually.
Doesn't Yeshua say himself that he didn't come here to do away with the laws? He came here to show you what that you
to fulfill them. People have misunderstood the meaning of that. What he's really saying is, I didn't come to diminish anything from the law. It's still forever, it still exists, it still is required. Okay? What he's saying is that I came to show you how to live it. That's really, and to teach you the deeper meanings of it.
Right.
In that very passage, he goes on to talk about, murder is hate in the heart. He showed us a deeper meaning to it. Mm-hmm. But that in no way means that we're not required not to murder. The law is still there. We still have to obey it. And that's the true for all the Scripture. He didn't come to remove a jot or tittle of it. It's all the same. It's all forever. Okay. And this goes back to several things that the Tanakh says, do not add to or take away from. Right. Do not add to or take away from anything I've said. If Deuteronomy 28:14 says that if you turn to the left or the right of anything I have said, to go after other mighty ones, from Yahweh's economy to add to or take away from what he has said, or to turn to the left or right of anything he said, is the same thing as serving a different God. Right. Okay, having a different authority above you. And so this is why it's very important to remember that any interpretation must come from the Scripture and the Scripture only. without additions and subtractions.
Now, don't you feel that when you're reading the scriptures, you should read it in the aspect of understanding who the writer is and understanding word for word, scripture
Sure.
to scripture,
Sure.
as to what it's actually saying?
Sure, context is extremely important. And
Past, present,
yeah,
plural, singular.
past, present, yeah. All the context is important, and there's really three kinds of context. There's the foundational context, which is the law, the Torah, is the foundational context. Then there's context of, say, the book you're reading. What was this book written for? What's the purpose of it? And then there's the immediate context of the immediate discussion within that book, because several books, especially in the New Testament, has several topics in it. So you have the general context and the immediate context, and all these contexts are flowing through the scripture as you read it. And so you also have to recognize, is this present tense or is it past tense? What are the pronouns? What is actually being said? And see, who is this pronoun referring to? You know what I mean? Pronouns don't work the same way in Hebrew as they work in English. So, we have to, you have to be aware of these things. It's important. And nowadays, most teachers, Bible teachers, don't understand them, so how are they ever going to explain them? As far as being a spiritual man, you have to understand that Brother James in chapter 2 said that faith without works is dead. Okay? Faith has to do with being in the Spirit. It's believing in Yeshua Messiah for justification from death. Okay? Works have to do with the law. Okay? Because Messiah is how you get into the Spirit, the law is how you walk in the Spirit. Okay? Because Christianity doesn't understand these two principles, this two-part principle, it has divided the Messiah from the law, and that's why they can't understand. In fact, there's a passage in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 and 6, that says that guarding and doing the law, all the commandments, doing them is it is our wisdom and understanding. That's how we do it, through the experience of walking it out. We gain wisdom and understanding.
Right.
And so the way of understanding has been lost in Christianity because they don't walk in it.
Right. So are you saying that if we believe in the Messiah and live in obedience to the law, we will all understand what the scripture really means?
Well, it's a very good start, for sure. I mean, there are several things associated to obeying the law that the law tells us. In fact, I have a list here. I'll read it with me on my paper. It says, the Torah says that it teaches us how to live righteously. Deuteronomy 6:24 and 25 says, the doing and keeping of the law is our righteousness, is how we live righteously. Okay? When the New Testament is referring to about our righteousness, it's talking about being accepted because of our own ability to live righteously in the Torah. Okay? Well, we can't live righteously in the Torah and receive reward or receive justification because we're already condemned to death because of past sin and the sin of Adam. These two things have already condemned us. We're born in a state of condemnation. So the Messiah has to lift us out of that condemnation. But once he does, we still have to live a life that does not put us back into condemnation. And that's what the law is for.
Explain what the Torah is, because some people don't understand what that is.
Mm-hmm.
So explain what that is.
Well, the Torah generally refers to the 5 books of Moses.
Okay.
The law, as Yahweh spoke it from the mountain through Moses to the children of Israel. And by the way, that Torah, according to Deuteronomy, Numbers 15 and 16, that law applied to both the native-born Israelite and the Gentile or stranger who joined them. So it's always applied to everybody who was in covenant with Yahweh. It didn't matter what their bloodline was. That's the same argument Paul's making in the New Testament. Okay, Paul says there is no Jew, or in Messiah there's no Jew or Gentile, no, male or female. It's all one. We all have the same laws, the same requirements, the same faith. Okay, so, but the word Torah itself just means instruction. It's translated law, which is not a very good translation of it, but it means instruction. It comes from the word yada. Yada means to flow out, and in the context of words and stuff like this, it has to do with teaching. Mm-hmm. So the word Torah just means teaching or instruction.
Right.
Okay. Now, we use that in many different ways. Instruction, Torah could apply any kind of instruction, but the instruction of Yahweh is what we call the Book of Moses. And the law is given at Mount Sinai. There are several things that need to be understood before you can understand the Scripture correctly. The first thing is that you have to be spiritual.
Yes.
You have to believe in Messiah, and you have to be walking in obedience to the Torah.
Okay.
Okay, but I have a small list here of other things, and I'll give you what that thing is and where you can find it. Yeah, so we've talked about Scripture only, no additions or subtractions. That Ecclesiastes 3:15 is a very good verse to understand what it means to fear Yahweh and Scripture only, how important it is. We have to get rid of all the man-made traditions. Matthew 15:1-9, Messiah said the man-made traditions were nullifying. They nullified the Scripture, so we need to get rid of them. You can't turn to the left or the right. We mentioned that, or from anything it says. We mentioned that. Deuteronomy 13 says that if a prophet or a miracle comes about you, among you, and does miracles, but they teach you to go in some way other than the Torah, then they're a false prophet, and we need to get rid of them. You got to remember, as I mentioned, there's one law for both the native-born and the Gentile. You got to remember, that's at Leviticus 19:33 and 34, and Numbers 15:15 and 16. That's just a couple of places. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, so you got to remember that there's nothing new in the New Testament. Everything in the New Testament has founded in the Old Testament. We got to remember that. That's Ecclesiastes 1:9. You got to remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, that everything written in the Old Testament is instruction. There's shadow pictures and examples and stuff that we have to know, and patterns and stuff like that we need to follow in interpreting the Scripture. So all these things must be integrated.
Those are very interesting too.
Yeah, they're very interesting. You learn a lot from them. Yeah. We got to remember that according to the Scripture, there's always the two parts to everything. So the truth has two parts. It has the living truth, which is Yeshua, and it has the written truth, which is the Torah. And so you have this dichotomy, okay? Messiah is the Word, so the Torah is Him in human form, and
right.
vice versa. So you can't separate the two. You got to remember also that the Father, Yahweh, doesn't change. Malachi 3:6 and James 1:17 refers to the fact that He doesn't change. He's the same always. You're not allowed to serve any other deity but Him. The word Elohim, which is translated as God, means authority, and He's the only authority for a believer. So you don't listen to somebody that disagrees with Him or adds to what He says or whatever. And if you find out that something you're doing has roots in some other pagan religion or some other associated with some other deity, you stop doing it. That's just what we're supposed to do. What repentance means, to stop and turn back. Righteousness and grace is belief. You know, we are justified from sin based on belief, okay, not works of the law. However, works of the law is how we live belief, and we don't want to get those separated. We got to remember that Messiah is the cornerstone upon all wisdom and knowledge. So without belief in Messiah, there is no wisdom and knowledge. Okay, all wisdom and knowledge is man-made and demonic if it's not centered on Him. But you have to walk in that to get wisdom and understanding, and that's the Torah. You have to also remember Isaiah 8:20 says something very important. Isaiah 8:20 says, "To the law and to the witness." The law is the Torah. The witness is Messiah. It says, "To the law and to the witness. If they do not speak this word, there is no light in them." So if anybody's out there telling you that you can have belief, but you don't need the works of the law, they have no light in them. The light that you think they have or they think they have is not true light. So this is basically, these elements, okay, represent how you interpret the Scriptures. These are the foundational things you have to remember. So that when you start reading the New Testament, it becomes much easier. You'll know that Paul sounds like he's saying we don't have to obey the law, but it can't be what he means. So that opens you up to understanding, well, what does he mean? Right. If he can't mean that. So, and that's where the church has erred. That's where people err in their translation. So all of these elements have to be put together. I have a list that I'll provide you, and hopefully you can provide the viewers.
That'll be awesome.
And at some point I would like to, break down each individual element a little more and share that. So
It seems like it wouldn't be that hard to obey the law, to just,
not really.
follow His commandments, love Him as He wants us to love Him, and, believe.
Yeah, it's not hard to do. You just got to want to do it.
Right.
And the heart issue is the thing that'll destroy us in the last day.
It's a very freeing feeling when you do finally walk in the Torah.
Absolutely.
Mitch, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
You too.
Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much.